I'm going to begin with a little questionnaire. And let's see who of the Israeli leaders or politicians have said the following: I don't know what you want. I believe in what I say. I know what I'm saying without relation to polls. And polls are like good perfume. You can smell them, but don't drink them. So these quotes are Ben Gurion, Rabin, or Peres, and Peres, and we can really see through these quotes an image of a leader that sticks to his path, that is free of tension, that doesn't, have any real, consideration of public opinion. And the question is if this is really the case. And we all know that every leader in their own way try to understand and learn the attitudes and stances of the public, try to see where the winds are blowing, so to speak, in terms of public opinion. And with this view, I'd like to begin because behind these numbers that I'm going to present to you today, there is the basic assumption that the role of public opinion is to determine attitude, sentiment, to set boundaries for decision making, meaning public opinion, bottom line, is a vague mandate, a flexible mandate, but also one that has specific boundaries. So our research tells the story of the Israeli society. That's what we do in the department of the INSS. And as I can show you, it's a very contradictory society here in Israel, but there's also a logic to it, and we'll address those as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the study. The INSS has been conducting this since 1984. Some of the questions are repeat questions, obviously, which allows us to learn, to compare in a longitudinal study various changes and in attitudes and stances among the Israeli public. These are face-to-face interviews, which is a very rare methodology today, but it's a very in-depth methodology, and it's also based on a broad sampling and polling, representative sampling of Jews and Arabs, in excluding those cases where the dissimilarities are greater than the similarities. And I'll show you the sample population, and this is an opportunity before I say thank you to the Pori Institute director, to Mr. Rosenblum and all of their team, and all of the wonderful people that do all of the groundwork for us. This is for the last 5 years. They've been doing so with dedication. Thank you so much. Okay. Now to the numbers, if I may. So what is the INSS index? The National Security Index. You can see what it's comprised of here. And our index, you can see on the one hand the issue of threats and challenges. This is within the general envelope that in which we include all of the issues that you can see within the ellipses, the northern front, nuclear Iran, and so on and so forth. On the other side, you see issues that I believe, at least, are the infrastructure of everything, the foundation, what the entire issue is debated on, meaning values, beliefs, core beliefs, and so forth. That's what I'll begin with, and I'll end with that as well, the question of core beliefs. Now, worldview and values, meaning core beliefs, and I'll show you this in the slides later on, it's the psychology of a nation. Because behind these terms, worldviews and values, what we see oftentimes, mantras, slogans. I'll show you the statements that we used in the questionnaire. And it's usually based on the folklore of a people, the history of a nation, its theology, meaning the overall things that come about into its psyche. And we chose a number of statements that also talk about or tell a story about a society. And we see that these statements are used in the rhetoric of leaders of Israel and also the people of Israel, meaning the common people who are citizens. So we can see, and you are asked, or people are asked, to agree or disagree, and to what event, to what measure. So the first statement is, to what extent do you agree with the following sentences regarding Israel's relationship with the world? And a vast number, 60%, believe that the Jewish people is the chosen nation. 56% say the nation will dwell alone. 49% say that the world is against it. This is a story of a society that oftentimes feels that they are under siege. And one of the explanations for this narrative is that this is what protects Israeli society. This is what helps our society deal with the threats, because it's a feeling, I will talk about this in greater detail later, how we are all together in this. And what you can see, this is a statement now that we added just this year: we can only count on ourselves. Meaning that sense of we're special, Israel is special, we're alone, but also maybe the entire world is against us, but 82% say we can only rely on ourselves, meaning 82% of respondents believe that we're alone in this fight. So that's in regards to Israel's relation to the world. This is something that you should keep in mind, because we're going to see this again and again later on. Okay. Another number of statements has to do with Israel's strategic situation, meaning how do Israelis feel in regards to our set of circumstances. 66% say the state of Israel is a villa in the jungle. Now, what does this mean? Meaning Israel is very contradictory, but there's one kind of view, and we'll see this recurring again and again. The feeling of Israel's on the one hand is really great, that Israelis are usually quite optimistic, feel great about their personal situation and that of the country. Well, here is a classic example. We are a villa in the jungle, meaning most people think that we are living in a much better situation, that the sentiment is, even when we talk about the terrible state of affairs security-wise, the situation is still considered good by Israelis, and on the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, we will always live by the sword, 64%, meaning this is a deterministic statement that the public, and we know that leaders in Israel have used it very often, this mantra, that we will always live by the sword. This is a feeling that is common among the public, and we see this in the research as well, that people are in a state of readiness. Doesn't matter if it's routine or a time of war. Israelis often feel that war is always imminent, it's always around the corner. Now, I'd also like to talk to you about two statistics, because Israel's democracy is in a state of concern or of threat. That was one of the issues that we talked about. What's interesting this year, that there's a sharp increase this year in the feeling of Israel's democracy is under threat. We saw 43%, now we have 55% this year, and there's a drop, more moderate one, about Israel's strategic position, which has never been better. We had over 50% last year that agreed with this. Now we have 44%. It's a 6% drop. Okay. So if we saw that this is the feeling and that's the sentiment among the public, let's look now to the issue of threats and challenges, meaning what do people feel are the threats, how do they perceive those threats, and how do they see Israel's capability in dealing with those threats. And the first slide that I'd like to show you is one on what is the external threat to Israel, or the biggest external threat. And we can see the biggest bomb here in blue, the northern arena. The northern arena in our study in the last 3 years has shown that the Israeli public sees it as a continuous problem, and I can tell you that prior to this 3-year period, the numbers were much lower. They're around 12% lower. So the Israeli public is taking on the narrative that sees the northern border as our biggest threat from outside. Second, 26% is nuclear Iran. In the last 4 years since the agreement with Iran, we've seen that this has only gone down. It was about 20% this year. For the first time, we see an increase to the numbers that we saw in 20. So people are more concerned of nuclear Iran this year than they were last year. I do want to say something in regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You see 14%, a very significant drop from it was about 30% during the time of the wave of terrorist attacks, and after a significant drop there, we went now from 30% to 20% last year to 14% now. So for the Israelis, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is quite minor. But now we use our very creative but, that the conflict between Israel's conflict with the Palestinians may be 14%, but you can't ignore the changes in the last few days. Because had we asked this question, we conducted this polling in November. I think if we'd asked it right now in the last few days in regards to the Palestinian conflict, I think the numbers would still be quite low. And the reason is that we have seen over time in our study that the Israeli is marking ad hoc threats that they feel are far more significant than them personally, but when they see that this is when they rely only on views that are sold to them by political and military leadership. So the next issue has to do with the IDF and its level of preparation, and here I can tell you that these are numbers that are very constant whether there's war or campaign or crisis or nothing at all, there's a constant feeling of confidence in the ability of Israel to deal with these challenges. And I want you to look at the blues most particularly. I'm going to begin with the smaller numbers, actually, meaning the Israelis are sure but not very sure. That has to do with support by the United States and the reduction, or rather, and we've seen this in the last few years. A decade ago, the sense of support by the US was much, much higher, and now it's 55%, meaning it's a high number still, but not as high as it was in the past. I would add, though, that this really is reminiscent of what I said initially. The feeling is ambivalent. On the one hand, the Israeli public is saying we can only rely on ourselves, and we see this in all of the questions that have to do with Israel-American relations. Now we see the difference. So on the other hand, if we can do everything by ourselves, but we can't manage without our big brother's assistance. Now I want to go to the green side of the aisle on the left. The very high level of confidence of Israelis in dealing with terror attacks, escalation on all fronts. Let me tell you that this year we are in escalation in all fronts. In fact, this is something that we've understood through our study, and we brought it on all fronts because we had a list of all of the different fronts, and still the public really feels very secure about the ability of the State of Israel to deal with these challenges. And moreover, you can see that they can also deal with terrorist attacks. So this is just to emphasize this point. I want to show you that specifically when we talk about the IDF, is the IDF prepared for the next conflict? You can see a very high number. 87% of respondents in Israel believe that the IDF is in fact prepared for the next campaign or threat. Now this brings me to the next question, because soon we're going to give over the baton to you people in the hall, because the big question, I believe, is the Israeli public, is the home front prepared for the next campaign or next threat? Meaning a view of the home front among respondents, because that's going to be a big part of any next war or campaign. And here I give over the question to you. Do you believe the Israeli home front is prepared for the next campaign? So here we have an opportunity in Slido.com. Please cast your vote. As you heard from Adi earlier, we would like you to enter the Slido website and I can see it's already happened, and please voice your opinions. I'm going to read out the question to anybody who missed it out. Do you believe the home front of Israel is in fact prepared for the next military conflict? Yes or no, to a limited extent, to great extent, and so forth. Please vote. We'd like to hear you. Okay? Okay, Adi? Should we close the... Okay, we're closing the questionnaire. 68% believe that the Israeli home front is not prepared at all, or to a low degree. And if you're curious to know what the public thinks, well, the public actually thinks quite the opposite. Not exactly the opposite, but different from what you voted. And I would assume that some of the whole, people here are professionals and specialists. This really raises the question, to what degree does the Israeli public really know what's going on? And we know that the Israeli public thinks that they are well prepared. And you can see that there are also skeptics that think that, the home front is not very well prepared. And I can tell you that the numbers were much higher in last year's respondents. But that feeling of confidence is still apparent, even if it's lower than last year. So it's a question of public beliefs. If the public really believes that they are prepared for the next confrontation, and they're so, confident, does this also impact their view of what should be done? Meaning, how do they expect the state to respond, and what are their views on this issue? So again, we're coming back to you, and we're going to ask now that you answer the following question. What do you think about military activism in this regard? Do you support or oppose an initiated action by the IDF to prevent Iran from becoming entrenched in Syria, even if it costs us wading into a war? So let's see what you voted. Again, let me just say, I'm just repeating it. Are you for or against an initiated strike by the IDF to stop the Iranians entrenching themselves in Syria, even if it starts a war?
Okay, curious. Let's go back to the. Okay, so you can see 73 of you percent of you in the audience. 73 are in favor of such activity, and let's see what the general public thinks. It's completely identical. That's interesting. You can see that the gap here is even greater than the public on the issue of security vis-a-vis execution. So you can see that 70% of the general public are for such taking such proactive measures. And first of all, we ask this question. It's a relatively new one from recent years, and we do change the wording based on what's actually happening out there. But this question, you can actually learn a lot beyond the issue of the Syrian of Iran becoming entrenched in Syria. It's the public perception regarding prevention of war, regarding any active, proactive measures, and we can see that the general public is in favor of active measures, even when we ask about an attack in Iran, for example. And let me say this as a parenthetical comment. You know, when the option is actually on the table, the willingness to agree to such an attack starts to drop. But that's just a parenthetical comment. But what I would like to say, and perhaps I'll conclude this specific topic with that, is that the high sense of confidence. On the one hand, there is something, you know, very good about this. A society that feels threatened, it's of course positive, even if it's just a feeling. But on the other hand, a sense of threat, and we'll soon look at this slide, such high level of confidence also entails some risks. It is dangerous for several reasons. First of all, you know, it has a lot of aspiration in it, and also think about it, what it means for the disappointment or a sense of bitterness in the different rounds in the various campaigns and wars in the past decade in Israel. And you know, the larger the expectation, the greater the disappointment. Sometimes the expectation is so high, and so it has a positive aspect, but it also has a negative one, also with respect to public sentiments and preparedness. Another interesting question which we added this year: if Israel is involved in a war on the northern front or in Gaza, how will it likely end? So I'm not going to get into all the details of this slide, but just pay attention what high percentage of the general population thinks that this war will end with an unequivocal military victory of Israel, and what a percentage of the other color, a sense of loss, significant damage to the home front. Now, in order to show you to what extent or how interesting this information is, this is a slide that only covers Jews. Look what the Israeli Arabs think. It's almost the exact opposite. The Arab population in Israel gives much higher marks to a sense of disappointment, to severe losses to the home front, and that should raise some questions. And it's not that the Arabs think that we're going to lose, but the good question is what's more realistic. And in all the questions in which we compare between Jews and Arabs on this specific element, the Arabs are less confident in Israel's ability and in the ability of the IDF to reach such a situation, if we can define it as success. Now, before I move on to the next topic, let me just say, okay, you know what, let's move on to the next topic. We know from this that the treatment of the establishment is high trust. We can see that the trust in the IDF, the ISA, and the Mossad is lower. I'll say a few words about the IDF. It's constantly high, the trust in the level of trust in the IDF, but we should say that it has significantly risen this year from 83% to 93%. Perhaps it's because of the chaos in the political system. The responsible adult has already been mentioned here today. Let me also add regarding the IDF. Let me tell you that the public trust in the IDF, and that's at the core, has to do with the core of the soldier. That changes, and we've already seen that when we talk about professional and military aspects, there's a high level of trust. But when we're talking about whether the ideological disagreements in Israeli society, do they have an influence on the functioning of the IDF or not, we can see that the majority of the Israeli population think that they have a detrimental impact on anything that has to do with ideological, social, and normative aspects. Then the picture that rises is much more complicated, and most of the population thinks that that has a detrimental effect. And by the way, our research shows that the people support the current recruitment model and the model of the army of the people. We can also see here that if you had to consult to a teenager that was about to be drafted, well, the majority of the population supports of course, enlistment to the IDF, and it's a very small minority in the red to make efforts not to enlist at all, but the others are pretty supportive of enlistment. Anything that has to do with a set of values and ideological aspects, a much more complex picture comes up. The treatment to the top echelon is much more critical than to the soldier, and you can see that 30% believe that the set of values between the top echelons of the IDF today is far from that of the majority of Israelis today. A few words about the conflict. Of course, on such times we have to say something about the conflict, and I can tell you that from my follow-up, and I'll put this at the tip of the very, very briefly, the contemporary discourse is very confused. You can find everything you want based on the narrative you prefer. So very interesting things come up with respect to the conflict. First of all, the Israeli population constantly support any kind of a solution of separation, and you can see here the two-state solution. You can see the major differences and the differentiation that exists within Israel, and still 55%, this is just an example, support any kind of separation. Another issue, that's the annexation that's on the agenda currently. You can see that half the population objects to any kind of unilateral annexation, but there is a slow difference. Last year, over 50-something objected to it. And just as important, we had asked, when we ask about annexation, yes or no, we see a black and white picture. But when we ask about different options, you can say that the Israelis, most Israelis don't really support annexation, only a minority does. But what's most interesting is a continuation of the status quo. A very small portion of the population supports a continuation of the status quo. Let's skip this question, move on to the next one. Does a continuation of the existing situation without a political arrangement, does it work to Israel's advantage or disadvantage? The majority believes that it works to Israel's disadvantage, and that's across the different parties. We can see a very different process here, how it works in disadvantage to Israel. And ultimately, if I would like to recap the conflict, we must say, and I'll say this very briefly, that the majority of Israelis believe, you can see that it is achievable, but in the longer distance, in distant future. When we look at our studies, the majority of Israelis are very pessimistic. They don't believe it stands a chance, and you can see the difference, the gap between the dream and reality. So that's regarding a two-state solution. And before I conclude, I would like to say a few things about social aspects. And this year, that questions tell us about the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, not just the answers. And we asked, the sense of solidarity in Israeli society, has it weakened? And you can see unequivocal agreement to that comment. And another interesting aspect to this question, there was a follow-up question, and you can see that when we ask Israelis, what is the central element responsible for the weakened sense of solidarity, most Israelis answer that's the tension between the right and left, and that's much greater than all the other dimensions. We're going to devote a session later this afternoon to address this, and I can tell you that when we segmentize and we start to check in detail all the questions that I've shown you so far, if we wish to understand what is the main element that affects any position, that is, do you affiliate yourself with the right, the center, or the left? Or tell me how you are affiliated politically, and I can tell you who and what you are. That is one of the things that come out of this survey. And to conclude, I started out with worldview and values, and I'll also finish with them. And what do I mean when I say that I'll finish with them? The last question I'm going to present to you comes full circle. It's a circle that the Institute has been asking for decades, and it has to do with political values. Because of these political values, people have their views, and they award interpretations. Of course, we would like to realize all the values, but on condition that they don't clash with other goals. And basic values were an inseparable part of Israeli society. And now let's watch this question. You can see a comparison between 1988, when it was asked for the first time, to this year. What is the value that is most important to you? So some of the values remain stable over time, but regarding others, there has been some fluctuations. A state with a Jewish majority, it has always been a prominent value, but over time, in a gradual and consistent process, it became the most important until it became the most dominant value in this past decade. You can see the high percentage that shows it this year. Back in 88, the Israelis attributed equal importance to a Jewish majority and to peace. And now, today, 30 years later, a vast majority is ranking the value of Jewish majority at the highest place, and peace has been marginalized. And this leads me to my conclusion. So the combination of the place that the value of a Jewish majority receives, and the consensus of worldviews, which I showed you earlier on, a very unique people, that their future is at stake, their fate is at stake, the fact that Israel is under external threats, all these, at least for now, are this kind of ideological glue. This is what binds our people, the individuals, to society, and this is what makes it possible for this society to continue to exist. But look, I looked at last year, and I saw that I finished my talk with one word, that was caring. And I said that if there are so many arguments in Israeli society, then probably people care, because when we argue, then of course that's divisive, but argument also injects life, it's fruitful, and it is thought-provoking, and it shows that people care. And this year, if we look at this great fear of a weakening of the sense of solidarity, the ongoing election campaigns, and additional political and social aspects, well, this year I choose to conclude and say, care but less. And to all those who are involved, all those who do care, what they fear is an indifferent society, a blasé society that doesn't care so much. And I'll finish with that. Thank you very much.